They weren't just flawed, they were rolling catastrophes that turned dreams of driving into endless headaches. Hated by owners, mocked by critics, and remembered only for how spectacularly they failed, these machines became legends for all the wrong reasons. Here are 3 of the worst and crappiest cars in the world.
The 1973 Austin Allegro is more than just a car remembered for its failings. It's a symbol of a collapsing empire in miniature, the automotive embodiment of a company, and some might argue an entire industry, stumbling under its own weight. Born into an era when British Leyland desperately needed a small family car to compete with rising Japanese imports and an increasingly sophisticated European market, the Allegro was meant to be modern, practical, and innovative. What emerged, however, was a car so beset by design compromises, build quality disasters, and baffling choices that it quickly became not just a national punchline, but a cautionary tale studied decades later. At launch, the Allegro didn't look entirely hopeless. Its bulbous, rounded shape was unconventional, but it was meant to feel fresh compared to the boxy sedans of the 1960s. Inside, it boasted more space than its predecessor, the much-loved Austin 1100/1300, and came with new mechanical underpinnings like hydrogas suspension, a clever system that, in theory, promised a smoother, more sophisticated ride. It even offered buyers a choice of engines, from humble A-Series 4-cylinders to larger E-Series units. On paper, this seemed a decent, if slightly quirky, package. Yet almost immediately, the Allegro's flaws began to overshadow its intentions. Perhaps the most infamous decision of all was the introduction of the so-called Cortic steering wheel, a squarish, nearly rectangular design championed by BL management as progressive, offering better leg clearance and a clearer view of the instruments. In reality, drivers found it awkward to grip and downright odd to look at, making the Allegro feel clumsy before it even moved an inch. While later models quietly dropped this eccentricity, the damage to the car's reputation was done. Then came the real trouble: quality, or rather, the utter lack of it. Stories abound of brand-new Allegros delivered with doors that didn't align properly, gaps so large that rain poured into the cabin, and interior plastics that warped or cracked seemingly overnight. Rust could appear alarmingly quickly, sometimes in under a year, turning even carefully kept examples into flaky, corroded wrecks. Mechanics cursed the Allegro's design, too. The engine bay was cramped and awkwardly laid out, making even routine maintenance surprisingly painful. The result was a car that seemed, in the words of one frustrated owner, to return its driver's devotion with spite. That quote speaks to the uniquely demoralizing experience of Allegro ownership, where every creak, leak, and mechanical failure seemed to taunt anyone who dared hope for simple, reliable transportation. Worse still, the Allegro arrived at a moment when British Leyland could least afford mistakes. Production was plagued by labor unrest, strikes, and managerial chaos. Cost-cutting measures meant that quality control was more aspirational than real. And buyers, who might once have shown patience for a few quirks, were now being offered well-built modern rivals from abroad that rarely left them at the roadside. The Allegro quickly became a symbol of British automotive decline, mocked mercilessly by journalists, comedians, and even some BL insiders. Despite all this, there is an odd affection that lingers around the Allegro today, born largely from nostalgia and rarity. So few have survived the ravages of rust and neglect that spotting one on the road now is a genuine event. Enthusiasts cherish them not because they were good, even die-hard fans will admit they weren't, but because they stand as a perfect, if tragic, snapshot of what went wrong in British industry at the time. The Allegro represents ambition undone by cost-cutting, innovation undone by poor execution, and charm undone by truly shocking reliability. In the end, the 1973 Austin Allegro didn't save British Leyland. It couldn't even save itself from ridicule. But its story endures, partly as a warning, and partly because there's something almost heroic about a car that tried so hard to be modern and ended up being memorable for every wrong reason. Today, the few Allegros left remind us with a sort of bittersweet grin of a time when hope, stubbornness, and disastrous quality control combined to create a legend, not of greatness, but of glorious, unmistakable failure.
The 1987 Yugo GV arrived in America on a wave of improbable optimism and catchy marketing. Its slogan, "Everybody needs a Yugo sometime," promising the dream of brand new car ownership for the price of a used beater. In the late 1980s, when the average new car cost over $10,000, the Yugo sticker price of around $3,990 looked almost miraculous. For first-time buyers, college students, and anyone trying to stretch a dollar until it squeaked, the Yugo GV seemed like an unlikely hero. What they actually got, though, was a masterclass in disappointment. A fragile, underdeveloped car built to standards so low that even its own builders in Yugoslavia often joked about it, and they were the ones putting it together. The Yugo was, in fact, an evolution of a dated Fiat 127 design from the early 1970s, handed over to Zastava, a factory better known for its military rifles than for fine automotive craftsmanship. By the time it sailed across the Atlantic to American dealerships, it was already past its expiration date in terms of engineering and design. Yet what truly cemented its infamy wasn't just the ancient platform, but the breathtakingly poor execution. The car was laughably basic, a 1.1-liter four-cylinder engine producing around 55 horsepower, riding on narrow tires under a stubby hatchback body. On paper, it should have delivered Spartan but serviceable transportation. In practice, it offered an experience closer to gambling with fate. Door handles could snap off in your hand when you tried to climb in. Interior trim pieces loosened and rattled after a few months, and cheap wiring sometimes melted under everyday electrical loads. The carburetor was notorious for refusing to cooperate in cold weather, which meant that even the most patient owners could find themselves stranded on frosty mornings. Drivers soon discovered the Yugo GV wasn't merely slow, it was unpredictably so. Merging onto highways required a deep breath, a prayer, and a very generous gap in traffic. The gearbox felt rubbery and imprecise, and the suspension turned every pothole into a small disaster. Build quality was so inconsistent that even within the first model year, owners swapped horror stories: cracked dashboards, leaking seals, door locks that jammed without warning. Every trip became an adventure, though rarely in the fun sense. One owner famously quipped, "It was the only car where the radio worked more reliably than the engine." Another likened driving the Yugo to a lottery. The prize was usually a tow truck. These weren't just sour jokes. Consumer Reports and other publications documented catastrophic reliability, with breakdowns frequent enough to become a running punchline in American pop culture. The Yugo's reputation didn't stop at American shores. Even in Eastern Europe, where choices were limited and expectations low, people mocked the Yugo. The phrase Yugo itself became shorthand for anything shoddy, unreliable, or cheaply made. Drivers from its homeland told tales of factory workers fitting parts by eye, sometimes misaligning panels so badly that the doors barely shut. Under the thin paint, rust could set in within months, and the fragile mechanicals meant that even careful ownership couldn't keep disaster at bay. Yet in a strange way, the Yugo GV became endearing precisely because it failed so spectacularly. It was an earnest, if doomed, attempt to bring car ownership to people who thought they could never afford it. Its utter lack of pretension gave it a weird charm, a car so universally panned that surviving examples today attract smiles at car shows, remembered more fondly as a piece of living comedy than as a practical machine. The Yugo's run in the U.S. ended by the early 90s, hastened by stricter emission standards and the crumbling of Yugoslavia itself. Its short, chaotic life left behind a legacy less of engineering than of cautionary tale, that the cheapest new car isn't always a bargain, and that sometimes you truly do get what you pay for. Looking back, the 1987 Yugo GV isn't just one of the worst cars ever sold in America. It's a kind of legend, a reminder that hope,
cost-cutting and stubborn optimism can combine to produce something so hilariously flawed that it becomes unforgettable. And for every bitter owner left stranded on the roadside, there remains the shared memory of a car so bad that it united people everywhere, if only in exasperated laughter.
The 1971 Ford Pinto could easily have been just another small, cheap American car swept aside by history, a practical but forgettable product of the early 70s gas crunch. But instead, it became something far darker and more infamous, a rolling symbol of what can happen when corporate cost-cutting collides with human safety, forever linking the Pinto's name to tragedy, scandal, and a burning question of how far a company will go to save a dollar. Launched at a time when American automakers were scrambling to respond to rising fuel prices and the flood of efficient imports from Europe and Japan, the Pinto was Ford's quick answer to demand for something small, light, and affordable. With its tidy dimensions and low starting price, it appealed to first-time buyers, college students, and families needing a second car. Ford aimed to rush the Pinto from concept to showroom in just 25 months, an incredibly short window by industry standards that left little room for thorough design revisions or safety re-engineering. At first glance, the Pinto seemed to deliver on its modest promise. It was compact, yet offered reasonable interior space. Its styling was clean, if bland, and it sipped fuel at a time when every extra mile per gallon mattered. Reviews were mixed, but not savage. Few predicted it would become a legend of infamy. But what lay hidden behind its unassuming hatch and sedan shapes was a flaw both horrifyingly simple and tragically lethal. The placement of the fuel tank. Mounted behind the rear axle and without substantial shielding, the tank was vulnerable to being punctured or crushed in even moderate rear-end collisions. The result could be catastrophic. Ruptured fuel spilling onto hot exhaust parts, sparking fires that turned a fender bender into an inferno within moments. Some survivors described smelling gasoline dripping onto the pavement after minor bumps, a smell that could quickly escalate into smoke and flame. What truly scorched the Pinto's reputation wasn't just the design flaw itself, bad as it was, but the cold calculation that followed. Internal Ford documents later revealed that company analysts had performed a cost-benefit study, weighing the price of reinforcing the tank with a modest protective part, at an estimated cost of just a few dollars per car, against the predicted cost of settling legal claims from burn injuries and fatalities. The chilling conclusion? It would be cheaper to face lawsuits than to fix the cars. When these memos surfaced during court cases and media investigations, the public outrage was volcanic. The Pinto quickly earned a savage nickname in the press, the barbecue that seats four. News stories and consumer advocacy groups latched onto its dangers, and the car that had once been marketed as a sensible family runabout became a symbol of reckless corporate greed. The fallout wasn't just about Ford. It ignited a national debate about automotive safety, corporate ethics, and the need for stronger government regulation of car designs. Drivers' stories were gut-wrenching. Minor crashes turning into explosions, parents rescuing children from flaming wreckage, owners who avoided highways altogether out of fear. One owner described how a slow-speed collision left gas streaming onto the pavement, a sight that turned everyday driving into a game of Russian roulette. Even for those who never experienced the worst, the fear itself became an inseparable part of Pinto ownership. In response to mounting lawsuits and a tide of bad publicity, Ford finally recalled over 1 million Pintos in 1978, retrofitting them with better protection for the tank. But by then, the damage to Ford's image and to the Pinto's place in history was irreversible. Today, the Pinto's legacy isn't about its humble 1.6 or 2.0-liter engines or its basic functional design. It's remembered as a rolling lesson in the real cost of cutting corners, a reminder that behind every engineering decision are human lives, and that sometimes saving a few dollars can cost far more than money. The Pinto became the most literal kind of hot hatch, not because it thrilled drivers, but because it sometimes turned roadsides into scenes of horror. Decades on, the few surviving Pintos are sometimes shown at car meets as curiosities, symbols of a darker chapter when speed to market and cost savings overruled basic safety. And so the Pinto endures, not as the modest little car Ford intended, but as an enduring warning burned deep into the memory of an entire industry and anyone who wonders what can happen when profit matters more than people.